I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
And today, Mexico continues to make headlines as one of the most dangerous countries in Latin America.
Since 2006 to these days, most of the violence is drug-related, and it has become a much different violence compared to what we had in previous years.
Y delincuencia no se avanza y cuesta mucho más trabajo.
300,000. That's the estimated number of casualties in Mexico since the government decided to wage war against the country's powerful drug cartels. Assassinations, kidnappings, and bloody shootouts wreak havoc across Mexico. As the cartels battle over turf and illicit profits, the Mexican state seems unable to make a stand. Plagued by weak judicial norms and corruption, its militarized police forces turn to excessive violence and even torture. Can Mexico do better in its war on drugs? Joining me today is one of my newest colleagues, Beatriz Magaloni, a non-resident scholar at Carnegie and a professor at Stanford University, whose research focuses on state repression, violence, and human rights in Latin America. We'll unpack Mexico's war on drugs, strategies that have worked and failed over the years, and how this violent conflict affects the United States. Here we go. Beatriz, welcome to the show.
So great to be here, Doug.
Before we dive in, could you just tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I've been a professor at Stanford for almost 20 years. I come from Mexico. I'm in the political science department, and I direct the Poverty, Violence, and Governance Lab, which is based at the Freeman Spalding Institute.
And we're so glad you're joining us also in some of your immense free time, I'm sure, at the Carnegie Endowment. So welcome. All right, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I think our listeners deserve some basic details and background. Mexico has waged their version of their war on drugs since 2006, but the drug cartels and organized crime have long been present in Mexican society. Can you just give us some basic facts about the drug cartels and just sort of the prevalence of this problem in Mexico?
Yes, Doug. I've been studying, before I studied this, I was focusing on authoritarian politics and democratization. So it's really, in a way, paradoxical that the violence began to escalate when Mexico transitioned to democracy. This was in 2000 when the long-standing Institutional Revolutionary Party lost power after 70 years of holding the presidency and most of the states and legislatures, municipal governments. So it was an hegemonic regime. And now we understand that the fact that power structure was so centralized allowed the regime to negotiate with drug cartels, spaces where each cartel could operate. Obviously, the government received payments in exchange, but the country saw little violence at the time of authoritarian regime because there were these deals made behind the scenes. And so for the population, I think it was significantly better, fortunately, I have to say that, at that time, because people barely got affected. There was a lot of drug trafficking, mostly directed towards the U.S., which is the main consumer market in the world. And so the drug traffickers were there, they were present, but deals were made in part because the government was very centralized and powerful.
So you mentioned sort of that Mexico was for a long time not really a democracy because the PRI was the dominant political faction for so many decades. And then democracy finally arrives. And as a result, you have this widespread expansion of violence. So I guess as a good lowercase d Democrat that I am, I have to ask, was there a flip side to this? Like, is it just democracy arrives and now this horrible violent state? Or wasn't there some negative side to sort of a centralized, non-democratic society, even if they could keep the cartel violence from the streets?
The process of democratization did bring some positive institutional changes, and I would have like two. Well, actually three. The first one was the creation of a much stronger Supreme Court that right now with the government of Manuel López Obrador is playing an important role in stopping the president to do whatever he wants. So that court, and I've studied the court throughout the years, although at the beginning slowly, but by now has become an important institution. So I think this is very, very critical. The second major change has to do with the fact that the democracy brought a renegotiation of the way the budget is redistributed among the states. It used to be the case that only PRI politicians received really most of the budget, and now we have formulas that distribute those resources according to poverty formulas. So that really I have a second book that shows how important that was in combating poverty. So we saw those very important changes, right? And the third one was that there was a lot of violence around elections. There was a lot of fraud taking place locally. And Mexico created a very powerful institution that was independent from the regime that really could settle electoral disputes in a way that we couldn't do before for years. So they were positive changes. But unfortunately, in terms of human rights, so if you think about the number of journalists killed in Mexico, if you think about all the disappeared people and the lack of answers from the criminal investigations and the state, I think that Mexico is violating more human rights in the democratic era than in the authoritarian era.
We talked a little bit about the sort of strategy that the Mexican state adopted following the democracy coming to Mexico in terms of tackling the problem posed by cartels. And one of the big ones is what's called decapitation, which is essentially targeting the capos and lieutenants in charge of the big cartels. So I read in some of your work that was a very effective tactic in that they caught a lot of these people, but the strategy seems to have failed because it's led to a big expansion in violence. And I guess I'd be curious if you could explain why that is.
Yeah, so this study we made actually was interesting because it was the Mexican government who approached me, and they really wanted a scientific answer because there was a lot of debate in Mexico. Obviously, commentators and policy analysts were observing. I mean, this escalation of violence was really, as I mentioned, 300% in just those years related to drug trafficking. So it was obvious something was wrong. So two important results. One is that the most important increase happened in the first 6 months. And I think that you could attribute to people from the cartel fighting for control of the leadership. So there are factions within the cartel that begin to fight each other to see who is going to be the next leader. Also, there is a possibility that other cartels see the weakness of the cartel that is being sorry for the use of decapitated. And so there is the invasion of territory, and that's what we observed, right? Fragmentation and more invasions, more violence. But what really worried me more about that paper is that we also observed a significant increase in violence against what I call the general population. So people who had nothing to do with the cartel. So it's women, truck drivers, people from the communities. And so that meant that the homicides started to spread. So smaller criminal groups taking advantage of this power vacuum, invading the communities and spreading. And that's really what, to me, is the most significant finding, because after that strategy, I think that the violence in Mexico cannot be just thought of, it's only cartel people fighting each other, which is what the Calderon government wanted to make us think. Oh, let them kill each other. They are just criminals, which in itself I find morally very questionable. But that was not the case. There was a lot of people, innocent people dying, a lot of disappeared people, because the cartels started to turn against the population, use extortion as a method of resource earnings.
So I want to talk about the the result of the decapitation policy, because folks like Calderon and others pursued this policy, got rid of the leaders of these cartels and their lieutenants, and unleashed this violence, which is started with sort of a turf war and a power struggle over who's going to be back in control of these cartels. But it seems like that no one ever reasserts control. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about why that is and why the violence continues forever, it seems.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to monopolize violence. And if you think about think of Pinker's book, which is a very famous book on violence, across history. The key variable that tames violence is when the state is able to monopolize that violence on the one hand and create institutions that legitimate the use of violence by the state. So those two things have never happened in Mexico since the war that Calderon started. There is no cartel that has been able to monopolize violence. It sounds in a way questionable to think, okay, it would be better to have one cartel, right? That would really help, because what we observe is where there is more competition, there is more violence, there is more extortion, there is more disobedience by lower level cartel lieutenants that turn against the population. So I haven't seen the monopolization of violence.
In one of the pieces you wrote, you talk about how cartels decide the way they behave towards the communities in which they exist. Some cartels are buying toys for children, handing out meals. Others are extorting businesses, committing violent acts against the community. Why do cartels decide to behave differently towards different communities?
So we have a paper focusing on Mexico, and I also have a lot of work done on Brazil on this topic. So I'll try to make it very short. So we observe that when there is monopoly control in an area, cartels really profit from population support, because population can provide information to police or to their rivals, right, of where the operations are. So the population is really essential to isolate the criminal group from its enemies or the state. Similar to what Mao say about the guerrillas being able to swim in the water like fish, right? When the population is just there, who is very hard to sort out. So cartels know this, and they have for years, especially in their core areas, engaged in this form of behavior. When criminal groups truly come from the place, let's say in that case is the favelas that we're studying, they have more social ties to the community, moral ties to the community. Community members even call them the boys sometimes, and because they grew up with their children, and that creates some form of sort of reciprocity and commitment on the part of some criminals, right, that feel they have to give to their communities. But once the competition begins to sort of elevate from localities to big national organizations, these local links fall apart, and cartels, as I mentioned, when they are fighting each other, they lose control, they decentralize, they easily turn to against the population for revenue.
So we've talked about this explosion of violence, but it's not just the cartels who are committing these atrocities. There's also excessive police violence, including torture. Can you tell me what's behind the growth and expansion in police violence?
The problem is that the police, after the transition to democracy, was never reformed, and the police not only the police but the criminal justice system. So the system of prosecuting and investigating crime was deeply associated with the regime. They really used it to target enemies. They use it, liberally to get what they want, and they could send anyone to prison, torture that person, and put him or her in jail forever. There was no way out, right, of the system. And I learned about it as a pro bono uh, trial lawyer in Mexico with a couple of cases I did with my sister, who is also a lawyer. And a lot of my insights come from that experience. When we defended this case that became very important, it was even covered in the New York Times and Boston Globe and the National Public Radio, on a woman who killed a man who was raping her in the subway. And we eventually were able to get her out of prison at a time when really conviction rate was like 97%. And I understood really how the system operated. The police created investigations that were never really monitored by any judge, by anyone. They could do whatever they wanted at that time, including torturing, and which they did, torturing suspects. And then with that evidence, they went to the court, and the judge never even attended the trials. And in the end, most cases were convicted. So that institution never changed after the transition to democracy.
Has there been any effort from the Mexican state to curb these excesses in police violence?
It was until 2008 that there was a major reform of the system. In part, it was pushed by NGOs in Mexico, also the Merida Initiative, so from the State Department. At that time, I think because of U.S. Congress objecting all the human rights violations, felt compelled to invest in this transformation. So there was a lot of money put to retrain lawyers, refurbish all the court systems, and we study what happened after that reform. And we observed that there has been significant changes, fortunately reduction of torture, but we still don't have capacity to investigate crime. There is no criminal investigation. Nobody knows how to do that. And there is no investment really in creating that essential part of the justice system. Because without investigating crimes, if more than 90% of, now 90, before 97, 90% of the crimes homicides go totally unpunished, you leave the relatives and families and communities in a very hard choice. The government is not doing anything, either because they're inefficient or because they are associated with the criminals. So the choice, which I find human, is okay, let's take justice in our own hands, right?
I know you're talking to folks in your field work, and they're subjected to violence at the hands of the cartels, but how do they feel about sort of aggressive police violence in response? Because obviously they've got to be frustrated, tired, and sick of violence at the hands of the cartels and the drug kingpins. So what does the Mexican populace feel about the police response?
This is a wonderful question, Doug. And I think what we observe both in Brazil and in Mexico, it's a paradoxical result that people want more mano dura. So they want the military, they want solutions, and they think, the solution is just come with a very heavy hand and just do the job. And so when you ask about, which institution they trust the most, it's the military. What they would like the military to come to their, towns and enforce order. And we observe that brings more human rights violations. So it's not solution, but we observe this both in Brazil and in Mexico. I mean, there are extreme cases, obviously. For example, Bolsonaro today openly endorsing the police to just shoot people, like literally in the head, and just get rid of them. And it's very popular among people who are afraid, middle class people especially, who don't suffer police violence. So that's really a big problem, because I think that the accountability is really not working. There is a lot of misinformation.
When we come back, I'll ask Beatriz about how Mexico's war on drugs comes home to the United States and how these two countries can work together to stem the crisis. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Desperate to reduce violence nationwide, Mexican officials recently declared an end to the Mérida Initiative, adding that Mexico and the U.S. would work toward a new bilateral strategy.
Let's turn to the U.S. now. The United States and Mexico share a huge border and have a long history together. And obviously what's happening in Mexico and in Central America and the rest of Latin America is spilling over into the United States. So can you talk about the 3 or 4 different externalities that are affecting the United States as a result of violence at the hands of Mexican cartels?
This is really important question, and maybe one of the first questions, right, that we need to ask, because a lot of the policies that we follow, so let's say drugs are illegal, it's illegal to, to traffic even marijuana in Mexico, even pot, in Mexico. Obviously, there is, every drug is illegal, and that doesn't come from Mexico. It comes from a very strong stand by the U.S. on a drug war. So Mexico followed that, and it's like the violence that it takes to control a market that is really profitable all goes to the Mexico side, and also Latin America, I should say. Central America is really a case in mind. Really is because our countries are compelled to follow these policies, right? I think there would be solutions, and European countries have some interesting propositions in which it's not like, okay, let's liberalize the drug market and have everybody really, children and young people get addicted. That's not the issue. But I think that with more sort of intelligence, we could have better policies that do not make all these markets illegal, because as soon as you do that, it's very easy that violence escalates. So it's just so connected, right, to each other. And I wish that these things were discussed more, because we need the U.S. and we need the U.S. Congress to be informed about this, because there's a lot of externalities that come from policies here that are taken because, it's convenient politically. It's very easy to take an anti-drug stand, very easy to take these sort of, black and white policies in which you don't find middle ground. And I don't see a solution if this continues to be the legal framework continues to be as it is, right?
Let me ask about drug liberalization, because I think you're seeing that in the United States. I mean, Virginia is a relatively conservative state, all things considered. They just went through a process where they're going to legalize marijuana. So you're starting to see it outside of just sort of very left-wing or blue or libertarian states. And I think you'll continue to see that expansion. But I think I read in one of your pieces that the liberalization of the marijuana market here in the United States has not had a huge impact on trafficking or on the reduction of violence. So can you talk about the tie-in there between drug law and the cartel behavior?
So the cartels really, used to focus, it was mostly marijuana. And then when these legalizations began to happen, the price of marijuana dropped, obviously. There is a lot of producers here in the US. And so cartels very smartly shifted to, heroin at that moment, and then now synthetic drugs. So it's really hard. I mean, these are really business corporations, so they know where the money is.
So recently, Secretary of State Blinken was in Mexico, meeting with his colleagues down there, and they basically decided to change what had been the long-standing keystone of the security relationship, the Merida Initiative, into something else. So can you talk about a little bit about what the new security relationship looks like between the United States and Mexico?
Yeah, so the Merida Initiative has suffered, experimented a very big evolution. Began only with investment in armament and helicopters, and when Calderon said, I will wage a war, they were ready to, pour money into Mexico. And then, as I mentioned, when the critiques in Congress, the U.S. Congress began because of human rights abuses that were really voiced by every single international organization and local organization you can imagine, they began shifting approach and say, okay, we need to professionalize police, and we need to change it so that there is more respect for human rights. I think that the policies were well intentioned, but the effectiveness, it's really slow. And what I see is that every time there is a change in the leadership, I'm talking about the bureaucracy, then there is really a shift in policy. Every time there is a change of administration in Mexico, there is lack of continuity. So I, in my opinion, have seen that this could have really had a huge effect, and it didn't. So as of how this is going to be transformed, we only have 3 more years of the AMLO administration. So unfortunately, the first 3 years, and I know this for a fact, it was very hard to establish collaboration. AMLO was very distrustful of the Merida Initiative. And I think there is good intention in a lot of the bureaucrats that are there to really try to create better institutions. There is knowledge among those who stay, and there was no collaboration. So I frankly don't know. 3 years is too little of a time, in my opinion, to see a big effect.
So you mentioned that there's sort of a lag in cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico on security, and that changes a lot depending on who's the president of Mexico is and who the president of the United States is and what their priorities are. If there was a better collaboration and effort to try to stem the violence and the drug trade, what would that look like? What would a really smart policy be for the United States to help Mexico in this huge challenge?
So I see 2 really important areas. One is invest seriously in professionalizing police from the local level to the national level. And that investment, there has been a lot of money spent on this, but there is never really like a smart way of doing it such that good results are rewarded, right? So they send money where the worst states, the worst indicators of crime are, and it's never really clear that if there is a follow-up, what are the strategies for evaluating if they're doing a good job or not. So I think it has to be created. We send money to make police better, but we evaluate how this is going on. And if you stop, making progress, you have to make progress, otherwise you don't get the money. That has not happened. And I think there is a lot of knowledge of police here in the US. I mean, I wouldn't really delegate it to places, to our organizations that are only based on the US. So Colombia has done amazing reforms, bring people from Colombia, bring people who have understood how to do that. That would be, I think, a major focus, in my opinion. The other is communities that need help. So you live fully on heroin production, right? And we know where that is. We can map it perfectly well. We have done this with satellite information. The US and Mexican government have that. And I think create serious social policies that can create alternative ways of livelihood for these communities. This would be tremendously important, because sometimes, and we have evidence that poverty is what pushes especially young men, who are the ones who participate in these groups, to violence. So create smart social policies that are really thought of to reduce violence. And we haven't had that either. Unfortunately, the current administration got rid of some of the most effective policy alleviation policies. These were not designed, by the way, to deter violence. So the ones that I'm thinking have to be focused on youth. I think they have to be focused on youth 12 and 12 to 21, and really create the conditions for these youth to be able to go to school, stay in school, progress in school, and find legal jobs. So it's investment that is really geared towards that population. That is it's the ones who are joining the cartels, unfortunately.
So that encapsulates some changes that you might see the Mexican government make to ameliorate the situation. But obviously the U.S. domestic law and policy has an impact here. So what are the 2 or 3 changes to U.S. domestic law that you think would go the furthest to help reduce violence and the power of cartels in Mexico?
So I think that the U.S. should treat the drug problem as a health problem rather than illegal problem. I think there is evidence that works. I'm talking about some countries in Europe, like, places in Spain, in the Netherlands, and more countries around the world that have, this is a health issue. People who are addicted to drugs is really a major tragedy. But the tragedy, obviously, it's fueled by who is selling the drugs, but it's because people don't have health alternatives. It's very, very difficult to cure addiction, but I think that there should be a really strong policy to take care of people who are addicted, and who be able to win them off, with other drugs little by little, to follow up, to really, because there are so many people dying of these problems in the U.S., and there's been, as we know, a big corrupt involvement of big corporations in the U.S. selling these medicines, right, for pain, that then lead into addiction to heroin and other drugs. So I would definitely make an investment on health prevention, rather than just think of this as these bad Mexicans bringing the drugs here. The second one has to do with arms. As I mentioned, all the arms that go to Mexico come from the U.S., and it's incredible that assault weapons can be bought with such freedom. It doesn't make sense to me. And we have work that shows clearly how that fuels into violence in Mexico. Those 2 policies would make a big, I think, impact. A third one, which in my opinion should take place, is just about information. People don't have information. Nobody knows, what are the right answers. And so informing the public, because politicians fear for the re-election, so they fear they will take the wrong stand on this. But if more information were disseminated, as remember when people were all addicted to tobacco, right? There was a big campaign, and now addiction really dropped. It's amazing how much so these things work.
Beatriz, thank you so much for coming on and explaining this complicated and important topic.
Thank you so much for inviting, and such a interesting conversation, Doug.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.